Hi, everybody. This is Dr. Karen, and it is my job to make sure that you go to work confident, knowing that you are setting your students down the path to success. And I do that by sharing the best evidence-based therapy techniques with you. So what I'm going to do today is give you an audio version of Chapter 1 of my free ebook, The Ultimate Guide to Sentence Structure, the SLPs Roadmap to Language Comprehension and Expression. So here we go, and it's titled The Truth About Language Processing Problems. So if you're working with school-age kids, you've probably had dozens, maybe even hundreds of referrals for processing concerns, and you may also know that it's your job to help these students. And we often get these referrals, we take our best guess at what we should be working on, and then we start therapy. But that's the problem, is that many times at this point, we feel like we're guessing, and then we're just grabbing random things off shelves, jumping around from skill to skill, and we're not really improving much of anything. It seems like there's no way to get all the skills holding our students back into our sessions. And when we get these referrals, we also get this laundry list of concerns about what students can't do, which means our list of therapy activities is also massive, and we struggle to make headway with every single skill on the list. So some examples of concerns or things that we might be seeing may be some of these things. So maybe students give off-the-wall answers to WH questions no matter how many times you model the right answer and reword the questions, and your WH question flashcards are falling apart because you've used them so much. Or reading comprehension isn't improving no matter how many times you practice things like stating the main idea. When you ask students to retell a story, they look at you like a deer in headlights. So you get out some sequencing card decks and practice telling stories, but their sentences aren't sounding right and you can't put your finger on why. Maybe they can't answer inferencing questions and their teacher keeps telling you how badly they're bombing all their reading assignments. So you work on inferencing questions some more with different stories, but they're still not getting it. Written language and essays are a mess of grammatical errors and sentences that don't make sense. Or maybe they have the same simple sentence structure over and over again, and you've worked on verb tenses and pronouns because that's all you can think to do. But you know there's something else holding them back. Students may have weak grammar, and when you ask them to use a vocabulary word in the sentence, you get the same sentence structure over and over again. And the only technique in your toolbox for getting better sentences might be, can you use that word in a sentence? And you're just not really sure how to take it to the next step. Your students can't follow directions in class, and you've worked on the will follow two-step directions with 80% accuracy goal until you're blue in the face, and they still can't follow directions with 80% accuracy, and you're not sure why. And you just can't quite put your finger on your students' processing difficulties. And sometimes you might even get a parent who wants to look into some type of alternative treatment they read about on the internet that's supposed to be a magic fix because they're getting so desperate. Now, I've had all of these things happen to me at one point in time. And when I used to get these cases, I used to spend tons of time working on the same comprehension strategies that teachers were using, like stating the main idea, recalling details from a story, or answering inferencing questions. And I used my sequencing, WH question, pronouns, and verb tense card decks until they literally fell apart. My IEPs looked nice and pretty on the surface because I'd written goals in the right format and I'd even figured out which curriculum standard went with my objectives, but I had a big problem, and it was that none of this was working. It might have looked good on paper, but my students weren't getting any better, and I was working on the same things over and over again to improve language processing. I was taking the behaviors my student couldn't do, like answering comprehension questions, and I was working on them over and over year after year, but they weren't improving. So why? Why weren't they getting better? Well, it was because I was missing something. It was because I was treating the symptom, not the cause. So what was I missing? Well, that thing I was missing was syntax. So syntax is the rule system that shows us how to put words together to form a coherent sentence, or the rules that explain how to use a vocabulary word correctly in a sentence, or how to use grammatically correct sentences in essays. The rules that emphasize what words in a sentence are important so we can make sense of what we're reading and the directions we hear in class. The rules that help us make sense of sequence and that help us stay organized when we're speaking so what we're saying is understood by others. The rules that show us how to comprehend a question and that show us how to answer it. Yet I'd worked on all of these other symptoms but had neglected the cause. None of my students were getting better, and no wonder they were suffering. I wasn't working on the right thing. I mean, I knew that sentence structure was important. I just didn't realize how important. But once I realized it, I wasn't sure where to start. I mean, I hadn't thought about deconstructing sentences since junior high English. And chances are, if you're reading this, you might be in the same boat. Yet, we're supposed to be the language experts, so it's kind of embarrassing to admit that we've forgotten the basic rules of syntax. Many of us have also forgotten those more advanced sentence types that our students actually need to succeed in school, which is why most school language IEPs completely skim over this skill. Or we might not see the skill addressed on IEPs until secondary school, which is too little too late. We actually start to use complex sentences in oral language as early as 5 to 6 years old. And if your students don't have a grasp on these syntactic structures, then they're already headed down the path to a miserable school experience. That is, unless you do something about it. And you have all the skills you need to make this happen. All you need is a roadmap to guide you through the types of sentences likely to hold your students back, which is exactly what I'm going to give you in this guide. But before we get to that, let's talk about some seminal research that's essential to understanding why syntax is the culprit behind so many language processing problems. So we'll talk about research done by Lobin, who did a massive longitudinal study where he looked at language development from kindergarten through 12th grade. Lobin wanted to see what skills stood out over the course of the years, and there was one standout language skill that stood out over all the rest. That skill was syntax. Specifically, it was the use of subordination to form complex sentences. This means that as we get older and our language skills get more advanced, we use subordination more in both oral and written language. So if you're thinking, what the heck is subordination? I'll break it down for you. We use subordination when we attach a subordinate or a dependent clause to an independent clause. And we'll get into these terms more in Chapter 4 of this guide. When we do this, we form complex sentences. People with stronger language skills use more complex sentences than people who don't. And many kindergartners are even starting to use complex sentences in oral language. So if you have a school-age student who isn't doing this or isn't doing it often, that's a definite red flag that syntax could be the cause of their processing issues. A poor sense of sentence structure can be a huge problem when it comes to anything academic we have to do, like reading a textbook or participating in a class discussion. Complex sentences are seen often in academic texts, yet they're extremely difficult for students with language disorders to process. Research has also shown us that syntax is a necessary skill for reading comprehension. Scott said it best in her paper, A Case for the Sentence in Reading Comprehension, when she said that we won't be able to understand what we read if we can't understand one sentence at a time. The good news is that working on problem sentence types not only improves sentence production, but it can also have carryover effects on reading abilities. So if syntax is so important, why aren't we addressing it more often? I'll tell you why I didn't, at least at first. I didn't know how. And based on what I've gathered from talking to other SLPs, I'm not the only one who's felt this way. Syntax is one of the most overlooked and underserved areas. Rarely do I come across a detailed language therapy goal on an IEP that addresses syntax. There are often some general goals about verb tenses or maybe some vague comprehension goal, but nothing that addresses the types of sentences that are actually causing students to have comprehension breakdowns. So why are so many of us missing this? Well, mostly because it comes so easy to us. We're competent language users, so competent, in fact, that we use complex sentences without even thinking about it. Because these sentences are so easy for us, we never really have to get meta about them, which means we don't know what sentence types to teach our students who haven't caught on to the rules of syntax yet. It's that we know syntax so well implicitly that we aren't explaining it explicitly, which is what our students need. Now, there are two essential first steps to solving this problem. Number one, figure out what sentences are hard for students. And number two, write IEP goals to guide us through teaching those sentence types. And that's why this entire guide is dedicated to doing those two things. Yes, we also have to have the right therapy techniques, and I'll share some materials and examples of that as well. But figuring out the problem and creating a plan with the right objectives is half the battle, and it's often the part we struggle with the most. That's why I'm going to set you on the right path. I even promise what you could call an IEP goal bank for syntax in this guide, plus some ideas about how to help students meet the goals in therapy. But let me say first that I don't use a goal bank. Instead, I use the process I'm going to talk you through in this guide. If you understand this process, you will rarely ever need a goal bank. Regardless, I'm going to give you one to help you learn the ropes, but make sure you're using it as a tool to guide you rather than a crutch. Now, before I wrap up this first chapter, I'm going to give you an overview of the sentence structures that will follow in this guide. So let's identify the difficult sentences. If your students are struggling with sentence structure, the list of error patterns they make can seem endless. And we don't have time to get to them all, nor do we need to. That's why for syntax, it's necessary to examine the types of sentences that are most difficult to process, because these are the ones that will give our students with language disorders the biggest headaches. If we're aware of the biggest culprits behind their processing difficulties, this can narrow our focus considerably. It can also make our therapy more effective because we're hitting the skills holding them back in the first place. Thankfully, Dr. Richard Zappoli Jr. cleared up some confusion with an article he wrote in Intervention in School and Clinic. According to Zappoli, sentences with the following can be really difficult. Number one, sentences with passive voice. Number two, sentences with adverbial clauses and causal and temporal conjunctions. Number three, sentences with relative clauses. And number four, sentences with three or more clauses. Now, don't worry if you don't know what these are off the top of your head. I had to look some of these up too when I started working on them with my kiddos. It's okay if you don't walk around all day thinking about center embedding and relative pronouns. I'll be walking you through each of these and explaining what they are. But first, I'm going to start us off with the first thing I do when writing any language therapy goal. So that's what we'll do in the next chapter. So if you want to read the rest of the ultimate guide to sentence structure, the SLPs Roadmap to Language Comprehension and Expression, all you need to do is click on the link in the description below this video, and I will send you the entire 36-page guide for free. Again, click on the link in the description below the video to download your entire free 36-page guide. Thank you so much for listening.